welcome everyone. Thank you, thank you. We are slowly getting ready for our next sport conversation for change. We want to welcome everybody to this space for joining the conversation with San Jose State's Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. So we've got a couple minutes, just letting everybody kind of come in and populate. Go ahead, grab your coffee, grab your tea, grab your water, grab a snack, grab a notepad. So you can join this conversation. I'm sure we're all going to have lots of great points, excellent perspective, words of wisdom that you may want to jot down. And so we encourage everybody to do that as well. So we're going to wait about one more minute before we get into this conversation here. See some people are coming in. Hello out there. See some of our wonderful students coming in from the Institute, our colleagues and friends from San Jose State University, those from outside of the university that are definitely doing some great work. Some in our San Jose community, with our soccer community, want to say a hello there, and even some folks from overseas. Wonderful, wonderful to see you here today. So again, greetings everyone, and welcome to the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change, our sport conversation for change. Today's conversation is entitled, We Are Family, okay? And we're gonna talk a little bit today about sports, politics, culture, and the Black family. As you all sit in with us, I want you to also take a moment to look us up. Should you want to learn more about the Institute, definitely take a moment to connect with us on our webpage at sjsuwordstoaction.com. Look for us on Facebook as well as Twitter. And thanks to our amazing interns with the Institute, they have got us connected to Instagram. So take a moment to do that. We are thrilled. I am thrilled as a technology challenged individual with the social media, but definitely connect with us with our hashtag sjsuwordstoaction.com. In addition, as we start to think about the Institute, this is again our first program of the 2021 year. But if you're not familiar with us, the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change was founded in 2017 and really is the brainchild of Dr. Henry Edwards. So we at the Institute are here to continue this legacy of equity and social justice, which is not only steeped within the Olympic Project for Human Rights and the work of Dr. Edwards and Ken Noel, but also within the SJSU DNA. So thank you and welcome to our program. So again, this is the first conversation in the series. I'm Dr. Akila Carter-Francique, again, the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. The mission of the Institute is one that's dedicated to research, analysis, and education at the intersection of sport and society. So to learn more, again, connect with us. And over the next few minutes, I really want to, or I should say next hour, want you to think about what we do at the Institute, and then talking about this conversation today. It's going to be an opportunity really to celebrate Black people in sport, to illuminate the ways that we have influenced the conversation on race, on politics, and in our nation and beyond. More specifically, this conversation will examine the issues and experiences of Black athletes, coaches, sport professionals, and their families. The Institute will celebrate Black History Month this 2021 year with scholars and leaders today to discuss the significance of Black people in sporting spaces. We're going to examine the role of Black athletes and coaches and how they have played a role in our political conversations. We are also going to try to identify the influence and commodification of Black sports figures in cultural spaces, as well as explain how these experiences are affecting the representation, identity, and diversity of the Black family. This February 11th, this conversation is going to reflect on, as you see in front of you, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History's 2021 theme, the Black Family, Representation, Identity, and Diversity. The Black family has been a topic of study in many disciplines: history, literature, the visual arts, film studies, sociology, anthropology, and social policy. Its representation, identity, and diversity have been reverenced, stereotyped, and vilified from the days of slavery to our own time. The Black family knows no single location. Since family reunions and genetic ancestry searches testify to the spread of family members across states, nations, and continents. Not only are individual Black families diasporic, but Africa and the diaspora itself have been long portrayed as a Black family at large. So with that said, Asala notes that the variation appears in many discussions on the nature and impact of parenting, on childhood, on marriage, gender norms, sexuality, incarceration, and I'd like to add, in sport. So I thank you for joining us today and welcome you to sit back and listen as we engage in this wonderful conversation. If you would like to share your story, if you have any questions of interest, please place those in the chat box and we'll do our best to work your questions in. Want to get to know a little bit about who's in our audience today. And so I think we have a poll. If not, definitely kind of put who you are and where you're from in the chat as I introduce today's amazing guests. We have a number of student athletes here today with us. Some faculty representation, those outside of higher ed. Thank you for joining us. Again, for this conversation, we are family, sport, politics, culture, and the Black family. Number of student athletes, great. So one of the things, and a few of the things that we're going to try to cover in this conversation today are about, again, the notion of politics, athlete activism, social justice efforts. We're also going to work to cover this notion of culture from a commodification perspective, as well as national and international influence. And then finally, the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. So I want to bring to the stage, to the virtual platform, if you will, very excited, these amazing scholars. So first up, we have Dr. Travis Boyce, who is a chair and associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at San Jose State. In addition, Dr. Boyce is the director of the Ethnic Studies Collaborative at San Jose State. His areas of research interest are contemporary African American history and popular culture. His work can be found in edited and peer-reviewed journals. His most recent work is an edited book titled Historizing Fear, Ignorance, Vilification, and Othering, produced by the University Press of Colorado this past 2020. He also has served as a guest editor for a special issue of Fashion, Style, Aesthetics, and Black Lives Matter and Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture Journal. Next, we have up Dr. Leticia Ingracia Cardoza Brown, Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology at Virginia Tech. Dr. Brown earned her Bachelor in Africana Studies from the University of Northern Colorado and her Master's and PhD in Sociology from the University of Texas. Using a Black feminist lens, Dr. Brown's research focuses on issues of social inequality broadly, including issues of race and racism through the lens of sport, social relationships, and food, as well as Black girlhood. Dr. Brown's work can be found in publications such as the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, the Ethnic Studies Review, the South African Review of Sociology, the Palgrave Handbook of Feminism and Sport, Leisure and Physical Education, as well as one publication, The Shadow League. Dr. Brown teaches courses such as race and ethnicity, sociology of inequality, race and racism, and plantation politics, the Black sport experience. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Billy Hawkins. have so much to say. I'm really nervous. Y'all know why in a little second. So he's the interim department chair and professor in the Department of Health and Human Performance at the University of Houston, which, yes, is my alma mater. His teaching and research contributions are in the areas of sociology of sport and cultural studies, sport management, and sport for development. He has published in several peer-reviewed journals, as well as presented to learned societies in the areas of sport studies, to include sport management, sport history, and sport sociology. He received the College of Liberal Arts and Social Science Distinguished Faculty Award at the University of Houston. He is also a North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, also known as NAS, Research Fellow and Service Excellence Awardee. And he is a recipient of the Robert Maynard Hutchins Award for his research in intercollegiate athletics. Dr. Hawk has received a BS in Business Administration from Weber International University, his MS degree in Exercise and Sports Science from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and his PhD from the University of Iowa in Health and Sports Studies. Welcome each and every one of you. I have a personal connection to each and every one of you, so it's so happy to have you all here today. So with that said, I wanted to take a moment to ask an opening question. What, and this is something that we do in tradition with that we just started with the Institute, but what does sport mean to you? And in answering that, not only what does sport mean to you, but I also want to acknowledge and recognize your respective academic backgrounds, your scholarly expertise, and respective departments and universities in which you're here to share with our audience what your perspective of the current state of Black people in sporting spaces is at this very moment. So I'll start with Dr. Boyce.
So good afternoon, everyone. Happy Black History Month, and I'm really glad to be here. So first, to answer the first question, like what sport means to me, I grew up playing sports. What's interesting, I started out with gymnastics. My parents put me in gymnastics at 3, 4 years old, and then on to soccer, to football, basketball, baseball. I ran track 1 year in high school, but sports, intersecting sports and popular culture, you can see that, sports has this big influence on how we think, how we vote, what we eat, among other things. So, I mean, sports is an important institution in our country as well as on the global scale. So it's a very important component. I mean, it means a lot to me personally, but it also has this impact on how we view ourselves and view the world. Do you want me to answer the second question in terms of Black history?
Yeah, how do we, really, what is a state from your perspective, especially as a scholar, as a chair of the Department of African American Studies, what do you see as sort of the state of Black people in sporting spaces currently? I mean, these past few months have just been so filled with so much. What are you seeing from your perspective?
From my perspective, so I'm a historian by academic training that happened to fall into popular culture during my 10, 11-year academic career so far here. So, I mean, I'm still kind of new to the game, but I find it interesting of how we can look at history, how we can face history and face ourselves. So for me, it seems like, it's this roller coaster ride the last 5, 6 years. First with the murder of Trayvon Martin, the acquittal of his murderer, George Zimmerman, how the Miami Heat came out in support for Trayvon Martin. And within the last 10 years, you can see where Black athletes have taken ownership of social justice movements. So certainly that harkens back to 50, 60 years ago, as well as the early 20th century, folks such as Jack Johnson, who used his platform for better or for worse to challenge the establishment. So you see in the 21st century, 2021, where Black athletes are taking ownership of their identity, of their platform, of who they are, to enact social change.
Thank you. Dr. Brown.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be here. I too grew up playing sports, watching sports, from gymnastics to track and field to soccer. Unfortunately, it was never going to be anything more than fun for me. But I've always witnessed how deeply sports are embedded within our society here in the US and abroad. My mother's family is from Angola, and so soccer is huge in Africa and Europe and other spaces, more so than it is in the US, even though that's changing as well. It's always just been something that fascinated me. When I went to grad school, I had no idea that I was going to fall into sports sociology. But after taking courses and working with my advisor at the time, Dr. Ben Carrington, who is now at the University of Southern California, I fell in love with the study of sports, specifically focusing on representations of Black female athletes through the lens of controlling images. And that has been one of my driving passions since I started grad school in 2010. For me, thinking about my relationship personally and politically, I consider myself to be a Black feminist sociologist, and studying sports through a Black feminist lens is something that is necessary because the lived experiences of Black sports women are qualitatively different from that of white women as well as Black men, even though a lot of the literature as well as mainstream focus when it comes to race is on Black men, and when it comes to gender focuses on white women. And so being a Black feminist scholar, I find it very important to kind of talk about the contributions that Black sportswomen have made historically and contemporarily to our understanding of sport and society. I think for a lot of people, when we think about sports historically in terms of activism, we think of names like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, Muhammad Ali, all of whom made valiant contributions, but we forget the names of women activists like Wyoma Tyus. Or contemporarily, we focus on Colin Kaepernick at the expense of the work that people such as Maya Moore have done and contributed to the cause for justice and activism. And so for me, bringing attention to those stories is incredibly important and part of our shared history as a family, culturally, politically, and socially. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those great words. And again, you and I are kind of in that same space when we talk about Black women. I think about it passionately. And someone that encouraged me to definitely, push forward and allow those voices is Dr. Billy Hawkins. So yes, I talked about him, gave his accolades, but to be very transparent, he was my academic advisor for my PhD. So it is such an honor to have you here today with us. I'm so thankful for that. But to that point, what does sport mean to you? And how do you see the role of Black people in these sporting spaces currently?
Well, let me preface my response by stating that I am broadcasting from on campus of the University of Houston, which is located in a former slave state and persistently red state, which I'm quite sure Dr. Brown and Dr. Carter-Frenzy can attest for their journey here. And it's also the city as well as the university is named after a former slave owner, Sam Houston, who upon his death, he left his widow 12 slaves. So for my acknowledgement of those that have been enslaved, not only in the state of Texas, the city of Houston, but also throughout this nation and globe, I also want to preface by saying that the Biden-Harris victory have provided some symbolic empowerment, but I'm not delusional. One of the things that I hope all of us realize is that Donald Trump received 74.2 million votes, 47% of the votes. And living in a persistently red state, I hate to say it, but if you're white, you are a Donald Trump supporter until proven innocent. So I continually live up on a state of alert against anti-Black racists. So I said all of that to say that sport has provided me with a critical lens to sort of look at race and race relations to some extent. I enjoy sport. You know, I use it as a tool to get an education. I use it as a tool for enjoyment and entertainment, but I also use it as a tool to look at how race is often expressed and race relations are often expressed, not only nationally, but globally as well. As it relates to sport and the plight of Black people, I think we'll continually use sport as a means of social mobility. I think the challenge is in making sure we navigate the structures so that we can bend the arc of justice so that it can create, emancipatory, spaces for us to not only, express ourselves as human beings, but definitely live and, with much more equity in these spaces. I think one of the things that is also important, though, as we use sport as a means of social mobility, that we don't become racially aloof and disconnected, because a lot of times with social mobility, we have the tendency to do that. So, and we have records of some of our sport heroes, excelling, becoming socially mobile, but they have become socially aloof and disconnected from any forms of upliftment of Black people specifically.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So as we move into these respective segments of the conversation, I want our audience to definitely keep the words of our panelists in mind, their perspectives in mind, their lived experiences in mind as we unpack some of these issues. And one of the first issues and subjects I want us to unfold here is the politics of sport. This past year of political activity and daily governance under the last administration has been quite phenomenal. I don't know if this is even a good word to sort of captivate, but we've also seen increased advocacy for voter registration, to the election of the first Asian, first Black, first female vice president of the United States. We, and I really believe, at least I believe, that we have seen an uptick in political advocacy from Black sporting community. So with that said, my first question goes to Dr. Boyce. You and the Department of African American Studies recently hosted an informative Martin Luther King Jr. program and conversation entitled The Other America, regarding the political climate to include the January 6th insurrection. Can you share a bit of the focus of that program? As I believe, your most recent text, Historizing Fear, Ignorance, Vilification, and Othering, provides some of the foundation for that conversation, and also maybe provide for us some of the significance of the conversation and how we can attribute it to the Black sporting community.
Sure, absolutely. So, I hope, for the audience members, currently, and I can even hear it in my living room now, the impeachment is going on, the second impeachment. And so, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, I felt that it reminded me of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1967 speech called The Other America, in which he gave about a 1-hour talk on the campus of Stanford University. So I encourage folks in the audience to do a quick YouTube look at that once the conversation's over with today. And interchangeably, you can pull out contemporary things that Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about in the speech and add in present day issues. And it wouldn't have been the same. It would have been relatively the same thing that King was talking about. So basically, King talked about this idea of racial double standards, white privilege, among other things. So it was important, I thought, although, we were not back here spring semester yet for school, that our department stepped up and did this impromptu MLK community conversation in wake of the storming of the Capitol, just so people understand just the relevancy of Dr. King's words are important today and relevant today. And oftentimes we are miseducated or, are misled in terms of Martin Luther King's rhetoric as only I have a dream and not a full critique of institutionalized racism in this country. So on that note, with regards to fear and fear of the other, this isn't all, not in a particular vacuum when we talk about these things. That we have to look at these things in perspective. So these folks that stormed the Capitol fundamentally feared losing their space and their place and their power in this country, which is grounded on this notion of white supremacy. So they came in all stripes. You had working class people. You had a woman flying in on a private jet from Texas, Dr. Hawkins. So, you had a variety of people coming from various economic class backgrounds, but in the most part, they were relatively white and bought into white nationalism. And white nationalism can come in a variety of definitions, whether it's immigration, whether it's the suppression of voting rights, among other issues. So as we look at, more specifically with my book, Fear of the Other, historicizing fear is historical interrogation, how the use of fear is used as a tool to vilify and persecute groups and individuals from a global perspective. The book also offers this unflinching look at racism, fearful framing, oppression, marginalization across human history. So the aim of my book, and if we want to put this in connection with the Other America, is that oftentimes people in positions of power have create these narratives, or people that want power and fear other groups create these narratives that these people are bringing down our country. These people are a menace to society. The shooter in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Roof, stood up with his guns before killing those 9 innocent people at Mother Emanuel AME Church, said, "It's you people who are raping our women, who are destroying our country." So that's something I think is important, that the gist of fear and othering connects directly with the program on January 6th, that why this stuff matters. Now, if we put this into perspective, and I'll just leave this 30 more seconds, if we put this in perspective in terms of Black athletes, the plight of Black athletes, what's happening in sports world today, we have to understand that, again, there's a reason why Colin Kaepernick is being vilified. There's a reason why LeBron James, oftentimes by the former president of the United States, is viewed as not intelligent, low IQ. The woman from Fox News said, tell them to shut up and dribble. It's the reason why there's this vilification of particularly Black athletes or who are challenging the racial status quo. And it is grounded fundamentally on this idea that white America fears that their power, or their perceived notion of power, is slipping away. And so we have to put these people who are the messengers in their place and continue to vilify them and frame them as unpatriotic, as uncooperative, among other things. So all these things from a disciplinary perspective can be incorporated. So I encourage folks, and especially students who are interested in this work, to think about that in a broader historical perspective when looking at Black athletes and the challenges that they go through.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was a great setup and segue into this next question to Dr. Hawkins. We saw some robust engagement of Black athletes during the election. What were some of the benefits of their involvement in these efforts, like registering to vote? Do you think the resurgence of Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others prompted their involvement? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, I think when we look at sort of what it has provided, I think visibility, when you talk about any movement or any cause, visibility is critical. And when you think about, here, when you talk about professional athletes or collegiate athletes for that matter, you're talking about transnational corporations being broadcasted through transmedia corporations. So you're talking about having a capability of reaching millions with your story, all right, or with your cause. And I think this is one of the things that, Black lives, when you think about, Black athletes have provided, that visibility to movements such as Black Lives Matter. And not only visibility, but one of the critical parts of visibility is the threat to disrupt market. So this threat to market disruption, or this threat to shut down businesses, similar to what happened for a couple of the NBA games, that alone strikes enough fear in corporate America to capture attention. Because we can march, we can protest, we can take a knee, we can raise a black fist, sing kumbaya and all of that. But if we're not disrupting the market, our success of, disrupting the flow of capital to white America is not going to move the racial needle. Okay. So that was very important for, when we talk about the Black athletes. So I think the resurgence of the Black Power movement, which is manifested in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think played a key role in that as well, because it created energy, and that energy is very important. And, when you think about the Black athletes, many of them are saying, they're realizing that, no matter how rich, no matter how secluded they can live, they still are subject to the Black experience, right? So we have Black professional tennis players, Black football players being slammed on concrete, being cuffed and, abused, so it doesn't matter. So they're realizing that, George Floyd could have been their brother, or could have been their friend, or could have been, someone that, their father, you see. So they're realizing that the connection they have to the Black community, and I think that fueled them, moving in and using their platform, using their visibility to, enhance or contribute to, this Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you. And I think that commentary about the role and the experience of Black athletes, and just, yes, it could have been, their father, their brother, but I also say their sister. So with that, Dr. Brown, your work examines the experience and efforts of Black women. Over the past few months, we saw Black women athletes like Naomi Osaka and the women of the WNBA step into Black female activist traditions. You and I know that the coverage of Black sportswomen efforts is often ignored, as you talked about. It's often more silenced and even omitted from the history, right? So for those that don't know or are growing into their understanding, what has been the role of Black sportswomen historically and even contemporarily in these spaces?
So I would say that just as Black women have always been a part of the struggle for racial justice at large, Black sportswomen have too played a role in that movement for social change. Campaigns such as Say Her Name is an effort to bring attention to these overlooked and untold stories, even when we consider that Black Lives Matter itself was started by Black women, but that often gets overlooked in the conversations that we have. Thinking about the 1968 Olympic Games in particular, that year, Tyus, who I mentioned earlier, became the first American, not Black American, not Black woman, the first American to win consecutive gold medals in the 100-meter dash at the Olympic Games. But we don't talk about it. We also don't talk about how at that same event, she dedicated her medals to Smith and Carlos, who had, received such backlash for their efforts to raise their fists in the struggle for social change. So Black women have always been there. and thinking about the WNBA in particular as a league and as individuals that have taken up this effort and this mantle of contributing to this rich history and tradition of activism and focusing on these untold stories and being on the ground. Like Maya Moore, who was considered one of the greatest players at all time at the peak of her career, left in order to pursue justice for Jonathan Irons and push back against the ways that Black people in this society are continually marginalized, abused, and disrespected. I think that one of the things I find heartening is that more work is being done from a Black feminist perspective within sociology, history, and beyond. We are having these conversations and we are mentioning the names, and not even mentioning them. We are discussing the names and their lived experiences, who they are historically, who they are contemporarily, and their work, though not yet as widely recognized as I would like it to be, is becoming more and more known. And I think that as we begin to find momentum to build up these stories, we're going to have a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the struggle for social justice, because we cannot separate race from sexism, from classism, in order to make inroads into real social change. If we think back to the Combahee River Collective, who said that once Black women were free, we would all be free because it would mean dismantling all systems of oppression. I think that that's where we have to begin, and that's where we have to hold on to, and to really think about the ways in which those words still ring true today.
Thank you. And thank you. And hand claps and snaps for mentioning Black women, the Combahee Collective, and those pioneers that have really led and influenced my life. I know in the work that I do, but even just in my own lived experience. And as I try to create opportunities for my little one as she moves and grows in these spaces and places. So hearing those stories, hearing those names, we have to celebrate them. And we will do that next week, actually, with our National Girls and Women in Sports Day program. So we'll share more with everyone on that a little bit later. But to that point about that perspective, I want to even think about it from the work of you, Dr. Hawkins, how it examines this notion of colonialism and this critical race theory perspective through the books that you have produced, and we'll share those later so everyone will have. But the New Plantation, Black athletes, college sports, and predominantly white NCAA institutions, your co-authorship of books such as Sport, Race, Activism, and Social Change, the impact of Dr. Harry Edwards' scholarship and service, the athletic experience at historically Black colleges and universities, past, present, and persistence, as well as critical race theory, the Black athletic sporting experience in the US. There are a number of ways to view the influence of political climate at the state and national levels for sport organizational structures, the DEI demands that are coming forth, and even within our organizational leadership. Have we seen a substantive change within sport organizations and front office representative leadership? Have you seen some of that change, or are there areas we still need to continue to push to create some real substantive change?
I think there has been cosmetic changes, and it's interesting that when you look at most major social institutions, that there's never really a critical mass of Black leadership. And a lot of times, and I might take some heat for this, a lot of times the Black leadership isn't unapologetically Black, okay? And for many reasons, I think, we're coming out of an era when we think about the 60s. I don't know if you remember Manning Marable. He talked about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, that one of the goals was to have a Black face in a high place, have a Black face in a high place. And that was the charge then. But now we have to realize that it's not about just having a Black face in a high place. We got to have the right Black face in the high place, right? And not only that, we have to have a critical mass, because when you think about the president, we think about former President Barack Obama. I love him, he's still my president. But you know, if you think about the president is an institution, you know, when you think of, you know, it's not just one person, and we can see that even having a black person or black face in a high place, we can see even having 8 years, the symbolic empowerment he provided, you know, some of the changes he made. However, you can see how easily after 8 years of serving, President number 45 has been able to overturn many of those, you know, accomplishments of, you know, President Obama. So having a black face in high places, you know, is great, but having the right person, having a critical mass is important. And we can see when we talk about it in the context of sport, this has been a problem. We see with the NFL, you know, there's the coaching carousel. We have 1 or 2 blacks on the coaching carousel. And, you know, some of these black coaches have spent 100 years in the league. You know, they have served and served diligently. They know the game, they know the system. And then you have a young white coach from nowhere, you know, just out of high school coming in. I'm kidding, not just out of high school, but coming in and getting a key position at a key with a key professional team, right? That blacks have served for years, you see. So until we have, you know, owners and general managers that have a race consciousness and a social justice consciousness, social justice oriented consciousness, as well as being willing to move their organization to reflect the racial demographics of society, you know, we're not going to see a critical mass of black leaders in those high places, and that's unfortunate. And I think this is where the black athlete comes in and using their athletic capital, you know, converting it into social capital to make those types of demands. And I think that's one of the things that we will need to see in order to make some significant strides in not only black coaches, but, you know, I applaud the women that are coaching now. I applaud the women that are, you know, we had the first woman umpire, referee in the Super Bowl this past, you know, week, you know, so I think there are strides that are being made when you talk about, you know, diversity and inclusion, but I think there's still, you know, ways to go, a long ways to go. So, and I think, again, it takes, you know, this political activity, all right, this social justice activity in order to push that race needle a little further.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for that. And that really takes us into our next segment of trying to understand a little bit more about the role of Black culture. So last week it was announced that the 1968 men's 200-meter gold medalist, Tommie Smith, athlete activist, SJSU student athlete, would receive his own Wheaties cover and box. How does the timing of this speak to the symbolism of Smith and Carlos' gesture and the organization of the Olympic Project for Human Rights with Dr. Edwards and Ken Noel, as well as the historical and contemporary narrative of Black athlete activism? Dr. Boyce, do you have some perspective on that you can provide for us in that notion of symbolism and timing?
Absolutely. First of all, just personally, it's about time. If we want to wrap this up in just a couple of seconds, it's just to say that, just to answer the question, it's about time. You know, I often think about, again, just the racial double standards that Black athletes are often subjected to in terms of behavior. So for example, just the other day, Tom Brady can drunkenly throw the precious championship trophy during a boat parade, but he's going to be on the Wheaties box, and he gets all these privileges. But here comes 2 bold men at a time where not only the gesture costed them their careers, backlash, I mean, potentially their lives, potentially they could have been killed as a result of their 1968 protest gesture. So first of all, I just wanted to just bring that up, this acknowledgement of just how racial double standards work in that regard. But in spite of the backlash, in spite of, you know, 53 years of finally getting on the Wheaties box since their protest, I think it speaks to the legitimacy of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. It speaks to the legitimacy of the civil rights movement, as well as the Olympic Project for Human Rights. That at the end of the day, I mean, unfortunately, they suffered, unlike some of their counterparts, but they were right. I like just to piggyback on Dr. Hawkins, what they said. He said is that being having the right face. I think about O.J. Simpson in 1968, who refused to be part of the OPHR, who said, allegedly, I'm not Black, I'm not OJ, I'm OJ, that type of a thing. And so I think in general, it speaks to the legitimacy. Now, it's important in terms of symbols. Symbols, iconography definitely matters. And I encourage the audience, again, to just go back to last summer in wake of the death of George Floyd, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter throughout the country, across the globe, where statues were coming down across the world, where King Leopold's statue came down, Confederate monuments across the country were coming down. Now, if we were to put this into a sports context, that reminds me of the Confederate iconography that's overt as well as covert iconography that's part of collegiate teams. I think about, for example, the University of Texas in Austin and their fight zone, their Eyes of Texas, as an example, that has become particularly problematic and related to this lost cause movement. I think about the University of Florida in the 1960s. We often think about Ole Miss and their Confederate legacy, but the University of Florida's football team wore Confederate decals on their helmets. The University of Virginia, played Dixie and waved flags in the post-World War II era. So the point is, symbols matter, images and iconography matters. And as we think about Dr. Harry Edwards, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, among others, doing this work about the narrative of Black activism, it's important that we look at the moment, we look at their agenda, but also we cannot deny the symbolic representation when it comes to these athletes and protesting.
Thank you. And continuing to think about this and the symbolism of those individuals, thinking of, how do we ensure that Smith's life, the life of other Black figures, do not become appropriated, commodified for mere profit, but actually serve as true representatives and figures of substantive cultural values. So Dr. Brown, could you provide a little bit of insight on that aspect?
Definitely, and such a great question. It's difficult to ignore the ways in which images get co-opted so easily and utilized for profit. If we think about Colin Kaepernick, for instance, and how his stance for the Black Lives Matter movement led to people burning his jerseys and all of his merchandise. So thinking, images matter, but then transforming his afro into this new symbol of the movement. But it's like he wasn't the first person to rock an afro. I'm looking at Angela Davis and thinking about the ways that these images have been around for ages, but are often, translated, like you said, and co-opted by the mainstream and used for profit's sake. I think one of the things that we can do is that if people are going to profit off of images, which they are, that we're giving back to the organizations that can actually do real work with that money. We live in a capitalist society, and until we dismantle that, we cannot disregard the importance that money plays in changing the game. Dr. Hawkins mentioned earlier, like if we're not attacking the pockets of the people in power, nothing substantial can happen. So if we are going to rock our Black Lives Matter hoodies and we're going to wear these bracelets, if those profits aren't going to organizations that are actually working for social change, I find that to be problematic. I think that there are a lot of ways that we can use images in order to push narratives forward, in order to really struggle for social change. And I think that it's difficult because we don't want it to just be profit for profit's sake, and we don't want it just to be imagery for iconography's sake. We want it to actually have political, cultural, and substantial meaning. But unless athletes are using their platforms to speak out on these issues, then we're not actually going to see anything happen. So it's more than just, being willing to wear a t-shirt, but are you wearing a t-shirt and then using, like the WNBA did, in order to bring awareness to people that are running for power positions in the elections, in order to facilitate people getting elected into office that can actually work towards making social change? I think that that's kind of where it begins.
Mhm. Thank you for that. And in many ways, it sort of gateway me to this next question, to continue on the symbolism and fashion. Dr. Boyce and Dr. Brown, you speak to, and your work speaks to sport at the intersection of fashion. And Dr. Boyce, you've captured this in your fashion style and popular culture aspect. One, how did you get interested in this area? And what role does fashion, to include, as we see here, Naomi Osaka's mask wearing, Tennessee Titans Derrick Henry's donning this particular suit with all of the names of those that have been lost, lives that have been lost, as well as even some of our college athletes sort of picking up, to Dr. Brown's point, this notion of Black Lives Matter t-shirts and paraphernalia. What is the significance of this and the role of fashion in this notion of advocacy and activism?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Carter-Francique. So, this is where I get particularly excited about. So, I mean, in terms of, my work, I look, when I started my PhD and, completed my PhD, and I'm working on some additional projects, I look at college presidents at historically Black colleges. That's like the boring stuff, but that's what I do. But this has excited me in terms of how people are utilizing their bodies, they're utilizing clothing and fashion as a messaging, a way to message to the world, challenging whether it's the racial, gender, or whatever status quo, whatever that they're challenging. More specifically, the historian in me thinks about how is this reflected in the past generations? Like I go back to Jack Johnson in the early 20th century. He was the first Black heavyweight boxing champion of the world. And one thing that he did that made white America angry, aside from a variety of things, dating white women and also winning the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, was that he dressed very immaculately. And this, angered folks. So in terms of, oftentimes we want to make fashion a superficial narrative, or it's superficial in terms of what it means, but it has these political and symbolic meanings. So in wake of the Trayvon Martin and shooting as well, moving forward, I got interested in terms of how are Black athletes, oftentimes they're muzzled. Oftentimes, they're exploited, their bodies are exploited. And this is a way, and even a very passive aggressive way, in which they can re-signify their bodies to challenge the racial status quo. So again, go back to the Miami Heat when they donned the hoodie and posed for a photo for Twitter that was retweeted, and went viral. Think about folks who wear the Colin Kaepernick jerseys or the iconography, when it comes to Colin Kaepernick. More particularly, I think about folks like Chris Paul. I'm a graduate of a historically Black college, and Dr. Fancy Carter, you see me at department meetings and my HBCU stuff all the time. So I'm particularly more interested in Chris Paul, who has silently but also loudly supported historically Black colleges and his pregame NBA wear. LeBron James with the hashtag more than the athlete. Colin Kaepernick wearing the Kunta Kinte t-shirt when he went out for the tryout in Atlanta to get his job back in the NFL. So fashion plays a significant role. And I think generally speaking, my argument I'm making again is that this is a way for athletes to re-signify their bodies at a time where our world just looks at them as a commodity, as a gladiator, and basically just tell them to shut up and dribble.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, is there anything that you think it might be important to add with respect to, again, I think about Naomi, I think about some of our other female athletes, or just this notion of fashion in general?
I mean, fashion matters. Even when we're thinking about like the Black Panthers, for instance, we'll never forget the berets and the gloves. Like fashion plays a role in situating kind of like in reflecting what power embodies, right? And so as Dr. Boyce was saying, as a way of kind of like speaking without speaking, wearing the masks with the names or the full suits with the names is one way to kind of say names without having to say it out loud, and to get people to look, because people are going to be curious, what is written on your mask? What is written on your suit? Who are these people whose names you're trying to bring attention to? I think that fashion can go a long way in kind of opening our eyes, because people are really intrigued by what athletes wear and why they wear it. And if it's a way to utilize their bodies as more than just a mechanism of profit for, white society, I think more power to them.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, because, I even think about, things for my children. They've got t-shirts that don, Black History Month or different historical figures. And it's very important. But also I think there's this international link that goes into it as well. And this next question is really posed to Dr. Hawkins. Last year I had the honor of serving on an ISSSSC panel and for international, sport, with the topic of racism and Black Lives Matter, with colleagues from the UK, from Australia, from Taiwan. Each presentation, I found it very intriguing. But what I found more remarkable was the reach of the Black Lives Matter movement on Black athletes specifically in other countries. And so from that perspective, what do we think about this notion of activism in sport and beyond? What can we attribute this sort of cultural phenomena, this reach of a US movement into a global space?
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind talking about
weigh in on the fashion.
For a second.
Yes, please do.
well,
please
well,
do.
In regards, and it's going to echo some of the things Dr. Brown and Dr. Boyce have said, but I think those images are very powerful, especially on the Wheatie box. I have the Wheatie box of Gabby Douglas in my office.
Okay.
So I'll probably go out and buy.
I've already purchased mine, so
yeah.
I've already pre-ordered from myself and the family. So
yeah. So one of the things I do want to say is General Mills, they, like other transnational corporation, right? And they have to capitalize it, on the moment, right? And I think one of the things when we look at companies like Nike, as Dr. Brown has said, these corporations have to stay relevant in order to sell products. Another thing, Dr. Brown, I hate to be picking back on you so much, but this idea of, I'm always suspicious of American corporations and their behavior, because they have a history of co-opting movements into something else or to mean something less. All right. And we see that a lot when we talk about Colin Kaepernick. Here we have Nike coming in, and that's another story. I don't want to digress. But going back to General Mills, I think it's interesting that they have a brother that's a Black male, excuse me, that's in charge. He's a chief diversity officer. I pray for him. I light candles, burn incense, because he's going to need it. But, you know, the first thing, I'm always suspicious about these corporations. And one of the things that they know, because, you know, I wanted to know, where's the money going? Hey, they're using these black images. Where's the money going? So supposedly all of the money is going to the NAACP.
Yeah.
All right.
NAACP.
So kudos. Another thing, but I'm still suspicious. Another thing that they mentioned is that they're going to double the number of black managers at General Mills. So, okay, yay, good for General Mills. I'm still suspicious, okay? Because when you think about it, you know, there's always this, you know, again, I'm living in a state of high alert against anti-black racists. You know, I spent 20 years in a red state that just finally turned blue. You know, so I always have to wonder how these images will be used, contorted, transformed, mutated into something else. All right. So getting back to your question, I just had to say that. Getting to your question about the media process, I think has shifted when we look internationally. And, you know, once upon a time, we were limited in sort of this media process and limited in the platform. So it was sort of a one-way type of street when you think about the media process or the communication process. But now, one of the things, and I alluded to this earlier, when we look at not only black athletes, but people in general, we have multiple platforms. The media platform now is much more circular, you know, so not only can you, you know, voice your opinion, you can create your own content and disseminate it to millions, and that's powerful, you know. And I think this is where this reaching this international audiences has been amazing, you know, and seeing how they are protesting, you know, and joining in, you know, 30, 40 years ago, that would have taken, you know, forever to accomplish, because we didn't have the access, we didn't have sort of the means to do that. But I think one thing with this platform, and one of the things that we're seeing with athletes, you know, that have a conscious message, and unfortunately, there are some that aren't. There are some that are pro-athletic capitalists. You know, I'm, you know, praying for them, burning candles, so on and so forth for them as well. But I think it's important that those that have a conscious message are able to create content and broadcast that content, and don't necessarily have to have it edited, you know, or in some cases, you know, at the college level, maybe, you know, you may not be able to say whatever you want to say, you know, if you're a college athlete, because, you know, they're still on that plantation system. All right, but that's not neither here nor there. So hopefully I addressed some of what you were asking there.
You did. And I think, you know, that's such an important aspect, is just, again, the reach of the movement. I found, you know, very, very fascinating, you know, again, thinking about this notion of the clothing. But even as we began to continue to spread the message, you know, the one of the first images I showed of the segment was of the of Namick and the statues that are actually in the museum in DC. And that's a great space where we can begin to continue to learn and educate one another about the significance, and hopefully not lose and have those images commodified, but we begin to understand the historical presence. Even so, I had the great opportunity over the past winter break to go to the College Football Hall of Fame, where I was visiting my parents and family in Atlanta, Georgia, and had the opportunity to, again, see the various displays, but meet this gentleman here, Terry LeCount. He was a player at the University of Florida, has trailblazed in so many different ways. He was the second Black quarterback in the school's history. And he actually works at the museum and was doing a lot to sort of share, you know, the legacy of college football, the legacy of even Black athletes. But one of the things he shared was that, you know, in all of this conversation, even that of HBCUs, he's like, I'm not in here. And so he just contacted me last week and said that the, you know, College Football Hall of Fame released this new exhibit, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the story of integration and college football. And he is there at the museum. They have told his story, they're telling his story, and he's there to meet and greet people. He met and introduced himself to my children, and they got to get to know him. So they were thrilled to even see him, you know, in this moment. So again, this notion of culture, beginning to learn I encourage everyone, visit some of these museums, not only that in DC, but there's other museums around the country that sort of highlight the history and the story of Black Americans, to include Black athletes in these spaces. So I definitely want to encourage all to take an effort and to learn more. As we move into the last segment, this is getting to the Black family. So we have a few more questions, and I know I see some questions in the Q&A as well as in the chat, and we will get to those as soon as we get through this segment. So please just hold on to that. But this last segment is really sort of near and dear to me, and I think to each and every one of you, especially as we think over the past few months, how we have been in tight spaces with our family, but also the effect on the Black family over these past, time period. So I wanted to really dive into the role and influence of sport in the Black family, from participation in, emphasis on identity to include athletic identity foreclosure, mental health and well-being, the use of sport as a safe space, a space to cope with the realities of racism and anti-Blackness, and try to understand a little bit more about what that means. Dr. Hawkins, you gave us some great insight on the sort of the global nature of the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you think, when we sort of acknowledge the reach and the influence, in what ways has Black Lives Matter and COVID-19 affected the role of sport in the Black family, from participation, socialization, and again, Black athlete activism on Black culture?
I have to say, when you think about one of the major things is it has provided education. It has, and how to sort of, use whatever means you have in order to fight for justice. So one of the things that I think, when you look at the city of Houston, I think, we're in a situation being not only the University of Houston, but also the city of Houston, a very diverse city. Okay. I think we often take it for granted as Blacks. I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, predominantly Black families, and we often take it for granted that there are still pockets within this city that you can go in, and it's like you stepped in a veil into a whole different world that's predominantly white. So the Black family has, one of the things has always been that place where we can, find safety, can nurture our children, and provide a springboard for them to be effective activists for Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Matter movement, or Black Power movement. So I think that is one of the key things where we see this connection of the Black family. I think there are some shortfalls. There are definitely some shortfalls when we look at how COVID has impacted what we do, because we are social people, right? And unfortunately, we look to gather, look to socialize, and I think it's important that we be mindful of social distancing and all of that within the Black family. But I think, again, when you think about Black Lives Matter, I think it has given the Black family a much more strategic role in how to go about, fighting for social justice, and educating their kids about, obviously in the 60s and when I grew up in the segregated South, the Black family, we had images to look to, right? We had people to look to, and from the heroes of the Civil Rights Movement. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done that, have given families something to sort of, educate their kids and show that there are individuals that are fighting for justice, especially if sports is a critical part. They have athletes that are fighting for social justice that, you can also bring into the mix in educating youth. And I think definitely the Black Lives Matter has contributed that to the Black family.
Thank you. But and this next one is that there was such great emphasis on the return to play for professional athletes to include women, hence my cover of these young children that are in the wubble. So not only professional athletes, college athletes, and even for high school athletes. So Dr. Brown, while the NBA and WNBA, created this bubble in Florida such that athletes could play within the COVID-19 safety parameters, some decided to play while other athletes opted out. Could you speak to the depth and significance of having to make a choice like this, particularly with respect to the Black family, on our mental health, on our wellness, and just our day-to-day lives?
Definitely. But really quick before I do that, I've been thinking about everything that Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Boyce and that this conversation has led, and thinking about this idea of Black faces in high places, and as our society, as a family, realizing and thinking about like OJ Simpson, for instance, that like not all skin folk are kinfolk. And so who is our family in actuality really, really matters. And so I just wanted to put that out there before I like lost my train of thought. Thinking about the wobble in particular and collegiate athletes and the sports that have been pushed the most to be played are sports that are played by Black sportsmen and women in a situation where Black people are dying the most from this pandemic. And I think that, especially when considering that many collegiate athletes and just Black students in general are often in a position where they're taking care of their families back home, either through student loans or through scholarships. And so you can't really put down what you're doing if you're not just trying to feed yourself, but your brothers and your sisters, and thinking about the ways that maybe you won't be noticed and you won't be able to be drafted, when that's the idea and the push is like, as sport as a vehicle for social mobility. I think also that it plays a huge role on our mental health, because as Dr. Hawkins mentioned, like we are social, like social relationships matter. It's why we understand that like social isolation kills. And so things like being in prison and solitude is cruel and unusual punishment when we are created and designed to be involved with other people. But COVID has really changed the ways that we're able to do that. I know that for myself, I haven't been able to get home to Colorado since this has started, because I'm not willing to get on a plane to put myself at risk or to put my father at risk because he had a kidney pancreas transplant. Like, I'm really not trying to, put anybody in that type of situation. I think for athletes, many of whom are probably still isolated from their families, be it collegiate or professional, because they're not able to, guarantee their safety and thus the safety of their families. And it's really difficult to watch. I mean, I, for one, have been horrified at the amount of push for athletes to play in situations that are unsafe. And I think that this push often comes because those pushing are not the ones putting their lives and their bodies at risk, right? And the ones that are putting their bodies at risk don't look like the people that are making this push either. And so I find that to be kind of a real struggle and a real issue that we have to pay attention to.
Thank you so much. It is that struggle, that mental health and wellness is something that is so key to us. It's one of our themes, even as we think about the Institute, but just in my day-to-day interactions with student athletes, I've got some wonderful students that are even working with the Institute just as a whole. And it is challenging. And even I think about my own self personally, but my little ones as well, who are just, full of energy. So I'm having to do all I can, take all these vitamins to try to make it through each day. So I want to sort of continue that notion and think about, how does the pressure to play from organizational leadership, from peers, fans, stakeholders weigh on the mental state of Black players, and to in many ways sort of incorporates one of the commentary from our attendees about how do we get it right? How in this effort for activism at the same time, how do we ensure that we get it right? And so this for Dr. Boyce, I'm sorry.
No worries. No, so first, I mean, my heart goes out to athletes that have to go in these situations. Like, I mean, as a now just regular guy, I haven't played sports in 20 something years, organized sports, But you know, I get stressed out. I mean, during this pandemic of just going out or having to go to the grocery store to pick up things or going into a public setting. So I can't imagine, and it freaks me out even just to watch professional sports or college athletes playing under these circumstances. So I can imagine just the fear and the anxiety that many of these young men and women may be going through. So I just wanted to just put that out there. One, just to show how bad this is, that just for regular folks, it's a problem. But you know, if we look at just again from just a sociological perspective, a historical perspective, I mean, this is just a continuation of just racial violence and trauma. I mean, to force young people, I'm going to speak specifically of college age athletes who are not being compensated, um, to put everything on the line so that university, that conference, can get that payday, whether it's a bowl game or a national championship or what have you. And I'm just speaking broadly about college sports, the system. I'm not pointing out any specific institution, just broadly speaking here. So, I mean, you know, that's something that needs to continue to be examined as we move out of this pandemic, of how racial violence and trauma perpetuates itself in many forms. And we see it right there with Black athletes. So yeah, I think it does have, it weighs on the mental state of Black players. I would love to hear accounts from folks that do that. Um, I would also encourage folks to look at documentary films such as the movie Hoop Dreams, even though this is not the pandemic related, as well as the Last Chance U series on Netflix, where you can just see the firsthand accounts of collegiate athletes and the pressures that they're under. And oftentimes, you can see a glimpse of their home life and their family life. And if I don't play with this injury or this concussion, I'm gonna have to go back home and I can't go to the league. So absolutely, it plays on this stuff. And again, just answering that question, how can we get this right? I'm just going to say it. I think we need to shut it down. I mean, until we are vaccinated in that context, in terms of the pandemic, we need to shut it down or put them all in a bubble. But also, too, we have to address the issue at hand, that this is about systemic racism, and this is about exploitation of predominantly Black bodies. So that's really the underlining issue here.
I'm just having a breath. I'm like, ooh. We are managing so much. And I think even to your point, yes, movies like Hoop Dreams, movies like He Got Game sort of show some of the dynamics. And now we're layering it with a pandemic. Now we're layering it with the acknowledgement, because some say, racial awakening, but I'm thinking we were already here. So I was already woke to it. So, but just the recognition, for others to kind of come to this platform. And so that mental health and wellness, I think, is something we definitely need to keep at the fore of our conversations as we're making decisions, as we're creating policies and best practices. So I thank you all for that commentary. This kind of rolls us into sort of concluding this particular segment, but to definitely have an opportunity to go into conversation of sort of, well, what's next? Per some of the commentary from our audience of some of those things, what next? So I have a couple questions here that I wanted to pose, but in doing so, and have you sort of think about, one of the questions was, is the inherent competitive nature of sport undermining the energies of critical mass movement? And so this may be directed to you, Dr. Hawkins, to sort of think about, again, our one of our attendees said, is the inherent competitive nature of sport undermining the energies of critical mass movement? To sort of think about. And then Dr. Brown, to you, one of the questions was speaking to the rationale posed that Wyoming Attias was protected in that time frame by the Olympic Project for Human Rights as a reason for not amplifying her advocacy and activism. So just a couple of questions for you to ponder on while I do a quick little commercial break and say again, thank you for everybody for coming, but that we at the Institute are one that are driven by your support, your financial support as well. So we want to encourage everyone out there to continue to follow our programs, continue to speak and use your voice, continue to contribute to the work that we're doing here, which is supporting students and colleagues and other professionals going to conferences, and as well as encourage you to continue to educate yourself through some of the works that we have at our very own Martin Luther King Jr. Library, to include the Dr. Harry Edward collection. So again, thank you for coming. As we roll into sort of our final commentary, I wanted to highlight some of the fabulous resources and then have each of you again provide responses on your works. And so again, thank you, Dr. Boyce, for being here, sharing your expertise. I wanted to share to our audiences some of the wonderful resources that you have shared with us and for all of our attendees to look to as sources. Is there anything you want to say as far as next steps? In particular, what are one or two takeaways you want our audience to have from this conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, both texts, so the Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture, that's a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. So I did a special issue on fashion and the Black Lives Matter movement. So that will be coming out soon, and it will be available for free online, open access. And my edited book, Historicizing Fear, you can get for free. If you go to the University Press of Colorado, it's open access as well to the public. In terms of next steps, as we kind of think about athlete activism, this idea of corporate woke washing, in terms of my research, or at least my interest in fashion, style, popular culture, there is this balancing act. On one end you have the corporations, and I believe both Dr. Brown and Dr. Hawkins even alluded to these things. Like there are these corporations, and of course they want to be on the right side of history, and so of course they're going to say the right things and put the right people in front of that. But my argument on the other end is that also you have up and coming enterprising Black business owners, Black fashion houses who are doing the work and who want to make a change. And they need that visibility as well. They need those corporate dollars. And again, Dr. Carter Francique, that's why I wear those Grambling and FAMU from
Prairie View, A&M, Lincoln University. Just a little shout out, Texas Southern.
Exactly. This is why, I rep that during the pandemic at, on Zoom meetings sometimes, because I think it's important to recognize Black fashion houses. So I think this is a way that we can get it right, is by supporting Black owned businesses and Black owned fashion houses. We're looking specifically at fashion.
Yeah. And to that point, thank you again, Dr. Boyce, for that. Next week, the Department of African American Studies, in partnership with our Martin Luther King Jr. King Library, will host a panel to talk a little bit more about fashion and emphasizing the notion of sneakers. So we invite all of our audiences to come to that particular presentation and learn a little bit more about the role of fashion, in particular sneakers, for Black History Month.
Thank you.
Yes. And so Dr. Brown has left us with so many nuggets of wisdom, so many important aspects, particularly as it pertains to Black feminism and the role of Black women in sports. And so I definitely want to thank you today. And to that point, we had a couple of questions from our audience and didn't know if you could speak a little bit briefly to the role of this protected Wyoming Attias and other Black women during the Olympic Project for Human Rights, as well as a couple of things that you want our audience to take away.
Definitely. One thing that I would recommend would be reading Tyus's autobiography, Tiger Bell. There's
Mhm.
a lot of insight into what happened in 68 in that book in her own words. And one of the things that I would ask is like, protected by whom and for what purpose and in what ways? And often I think that what we think of as protection is
Yeah.
really just another mechanism for silencing women or ignoring
Mhm.
the role that women could have in the movement. I wasn't there in 68. I wasn't even a thought in my parents' head at the time. I would
Right.
say that it's possible, but from what I've read and from what I know, that many of the women just weren't asked. Their opinion, their ideas, their thoughts just were not asked. And so I don't really see that as protection, but I guess that kind of depends on the purpose of the question and like exactly who we're saying protected her. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I think it's definitely true that that might have been like the
Mhm.
idea was to make sure that she wouldn't receive the backlash, but she herself did dedicate her win and her win was overlooked. Like even
Yes.
without dedicating it to that, the fact that she was the first American to do what she did
Yes.
wasn't talked about, and that itself is problematic. And so that's one of the takeaways that I would like from my kind of contribution to this conversation is that Black women have always been there. Black women are still there. We need to amplify their voices and their stories and pay attention because we have so much to contribute as women, as athletes, as human beings.
Mhm.
And I think that that would
Definitely.
kind of be, yeah, for me.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And Dr. Hawkins, he has again provided me such great guidance, great support in my continued development as a scholar. And I think you have left a lot of nuggets of wisdom for our audience to take away and to consider as they think about this notion of we are family, of politics, of culture, the Black family, and sport during this time period. Here are a few of the amazing books that you've written and definitely put out there for those to learn from. What are some final words, or even in particular, your thoughts to this notion of sport undermining the energies of critical mass movement, or the competitive nature, I should say?
Yeah, when I think about, and I hope I'm not misquoting or misrepresenting when you say the competitive nature of sport, uh, I'm interpreting that as the commercial aspect of sport. And that is always, troublesome when you talk about trying to, address or have the social justice orientation. One of the images that stick out in my mind is when Jerry Jones locked elbows with his players
Mm.
and took a knee. I'm like, hold up, suspicious. I'm in Texas. I don't know if
Right,
Jerry Joe. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on that. But I
right.
think it always have that tendency to undermine that commercial. When you talk about competitive sport, that commercial aspect of sport it can always undermine and co-opt a movement again into
Mhm.
some totally different. A couple things that I definitely want to leave with the audience, and I've been trying to do this for the many years I've been in academia, is encourage when I mentor faculty, mentor students to find their voice
Yes.
and join the choir for social justice or join the movement. And that could be in any platform. You could be a writer, you could, wherever you are, all of us have ways in order to find our voice and use our voice to fight for social justice. And I think it's important to do that. And wherever you are, okay, you don't necessarily have to be, we often think that we have to be sounding the loudest or have the most people, but it's always when you think about social justice, and I think this is Margaret Mead, and I'm sort of paraphrasing it, it's only been, when you think about moving the needle, it's only been a small group of people that have moved the needle, okay?
Yeah.
And you may be that, you know that. The last thing is, if you're going to be serious about social justice, if you're going to be serious and want to, make this as part of, your develop this social justice orientation, one of the things you're going to have to realize, sometimes you're going to be the sacrifice. Sometimes you have to make a sacrifice and be willing to do that and understand that, and, you're going
Yeah.
to suffer battle scars. I'm not talking about being ending your life, anything like that. What I'm talking about, you're going to have to, incur some battle scars, okay, and be
Mhm.
able to, endure those things, especially when you talk about, in many cases, working in predominantly white settings, okay, in order to make some change.
And, again, thank you for that and those words of wisdoms and encouragement too. And I think your books lay out that, each of those different texts speak to the sacrifice aspect of that lived experience. And so we can read about it, we can see it. But then there's ways, again, when we look at the athletic experience at HBCUs or the critical race theory text, of some best practices in there that we can definitely glean from as we continue our efforts. With all of our guests today, I want to say thank you and to think about you all as individuals in an institution of higher education, as educators that are using your platform, and to continue that effort and talk about the importance of continuing to read, continuing to engage. And so we've provided here a few texts for you to think about and adding to your library of reading. When we talk about politics, culture, and race in sport, I've got about 12 texts that we've outlined here to include Dr. Brown's mentor, Ben Carrington, to include colleagues such as Gary Sells, rest in peace, James Conyers, as well, that have definitely added their voice and are doing that piece to illuminate the role of race in sport. And to one of our attendees out there, Elevating the Game is a great text. One of the texts that I read during my days in school that spoke about the role of sport in the Black family. So if you're looking to sort of continue your knowledge and learn about the role of sport in the Black family, I would definitely recommend something of that nature. And for all my women out there, yes, I had to do it, Dr. Brown. Here are just a few. Again, it's just a few, 12 texts that begin to talk about Black women in sport, from an Olympic track and field perspective to stories of C. Vivian Stringer, okay, of Mamie Peanut Johnson when we think about the Negro Leagues in baseball, to what you spoke about, Wyoming Attias's Tiger Bell. So we hope that this will encourage everyone to continue their education. And if you're looking to explore more too on the lived experience, when we talk about the symbolism of the 1968 Olympics, 3 texts from our very own SJSU former athletes and educators, Dr. Harry Edwards, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, Tommy Smith's Silent Gesture, and John Carlo's Story are 3 that you could look to. Again, those Wheaties boxes I know are something that people have been, a lot of stories have been written about him being on that box. And so it is something that, again, from our understanding, those donations will be contributed to the NAACP and their respective efforts. So I want to thank our amazing panelists again. Under this Sport Conversation for Change, we are family, sport, politics, culture, and the Black family. I encourage each and every one of you, reach out to these amazing colleagues if you have additional questions, look up their works, follow their stories and the amazing panels and things that they're putting together to learn more and to grow in your knowledge about the story of Black athletes in sport. So from the Institute, we want to say thank you and want to encourage you to join our next Sport Conversation for Change, which will actually be next week, a special Sport Conversation for Change that will be a collaborative partner event with the Wall of Song Project, Mel Days, Feeling Good. So Feeling Good, celebrating National Girls and Women in Sports Day through a Wall of Song. And so this will be in collaboration and partnership again with the San Jose Museum of Art, with San Jose Jazz, and special guest, Lettucey. Oh, and I can't not not mention her, Dr. Jalila Burrell, who's one of our new faculty in the Department of African American Studies, will serve her commentary on this great day in which we celebrate girls and women in sports contributions, as well as recognize and honor a number of SJSU student athletes, faculty, coach, and staff. So we encourage you to join us next Thursday, 7 p.m. And we've got the event information there, but feel free to review our website and our social media to learn more about this event. So I thank you for myself, Akila Carter-Francique, the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change, as well as our Assistant Director, Dr. Amy August, and Executive Assistant Beth Doyle, and all of our amazing interns that support the Institute every day. We thank you all for joining and continue to follow us with our Sport Conversations for Change. Take care.